Hello everybody, and welcome to a quick thought experiment on news bias and market forces. This is your instructor Fred Curry, and the main point of this short video is just to help begin to undermine some incorrect preconceptions about the news and to objectively look at what kinds of bias market forces might produce. Of course, a tendency towards a bias doesn't mean that every story is biased, nor does the presence of such forces always guarantee a bias. However, companies are structurally designed to maximize profit. As a result, we should expect economic incentives to inform the perspective of the news. So, imagine that you are a CEO of a major multinational corporation, Ultracorp. Ultracorp pulls in profits of $46 billion a year. But it isn't just one industry. Ultracorp has its fingers in a great number of pies. When we are talking about real multinational corporations, we are generally talking about a far larger number of interests than those listed here, but this will provide a good sketch. Of the $46 billion Ultracorp makes in profits a year, 45% of that comes from telecom-related companies. 15% comes from entertainment. This includes movies, TV, cable, and so forth. 10% comes from web services, such as hosting, mainframe processing, data cloud services, and so forth. 13% comes from banking and investments. 17% comes from military contracts. Of the 15% that Ultracorp makes, 2% of that 15% comes from the news media. So this is a very small percentage. That is only 0.003 of Ultracorp's total profits. That is many millions of dollars, but is just a drop in the bucket in terms of Ultracorp's total profits. But the money made directly from the news isn't really the reason why news holdings profit them. The news profits them because it helps control the political narrative. Their news corporation could even lose money, and it could be worth it to them if reporting of the news helps reduce corporate taxes, or gets friendly politicians into office who pass laws that benefit Ultracorp. It is worth noting that a number of corporations and billionaires run news outlets and think tanks at an economic loss in terms of the news outlet themselves. This isn't because they care about informing people, it is because political opinion has the potential to benefit or harm them much more significantly than the small potatoes profits or losses of the news outlet. A bit more about the structure of Ultracorp. Ultracorp has 50,000 employees. The average pay of these employees is $32,000 a year. Some employees, like high-ranking managers or highly paid news anchors, actors, and so forth, can make millions, but those are only a few individuals. Thousands of their employees only make minimum wage, and many more thousands barely above that. Their workers are almost entirely non-union as well, at least the lower-paying jobs. Actors and writers tend to have unions, which is one reason why they tend to receive decent pay. So, as we saw, Ultracorp makes money from a large number of interests. Their news outlet also makes money from a variety of interests. Every election year, billions are spent on political ads. This amounts to real profits. Given this, it might not be surprising if their news doesn't support radical campaign finance reform. Car manufacturers in the fossil fuel industry are also major advertisers. These companies get nervous about workers wanting to unionize and too much discussion about global climate change. It might not be surprising, therefore, if unionizing and workers' rights issues are seldom covered by the news in depth, and if the environment is given short shrift. The military-industrialized complex also spends many millions on advertising. Also, Ultracorp has military contracts. It is therefore not surprising if the news tends to be very pro-military and pro-military intervention. Also, Ultracorp as a whole spends many millions in lobbying. They give money to politicians with the expectation that those politicians will pass laws that benefit Ultracorp's profitability. Given the massive influence they have over the government, and that other multinational corporations with similar interests also influence the government, it isn't a surprise if Ultracorp's news outlets are generally highly supportive of law enforcement and critical of protesters. So, assume that this is Ultracorp's background and you are a combination of the CEO and board of directors. What would you do? Would you hire editors and newscasters who tend to favor economic policies that favor the wealthy? Of course you would. Those policies affect your bottom line, plus you are economically motivated to honestly, personally believe that those are the right policies. Ultracorp makes a fortune from telecommunications, and eliminating net neutrality increased your profitability in that sector greatly. Would you report on net neutrality? Probably very little. This is a real-life case, by the way. There was very little reporting on net neutrality, even though maintaining net neutrality was a massive concern of both Democratic and Republican voters. Covering such stories would have been popular and increased the profitability of the news outlet, but overall hurt the profitability of the corporation. CNN, for example, is owned by Time Warner. MSNBC is owned by Comcast. These corporations do not favor net neutrality. UltraCorp pays many of its workers a minimum wage, and so do many of the advertisers on UltraCorp's networks. Would your incentive be for newscasts to favor raising minimum wage? Likely not. Most of your workers are non-union. Unionized workers get paid more and can demand better working conditions, which cost your company money. Would you have an economic incentive to report on unions favorably? Of course not. As a CEO, you make $50 million or so a year. Would you have an economic incentive to report favorably on a proposed wealth tax that affects only multimillionaires? Of course not. You want this to be an unpopular position. Your entertainment outlets make billions off of campaign advertisements. Do you have an economic incentive to discuss campaign finance reform? Remember that UltraCorp lobbies politicians in order to get those politicians to pass laws that favor your company. So of course you don't spend much time covering campaign finance reform or talk about how lobbying corrupts a democracy. What about your economic incentive regarding the military and law enforcement? Of course your incentive is to be favorable here. The status quo is greatly profiting your corporation. A great deal of your money comes from military contracts, and so active military engagement tends to directly translate into profit. In addition, you're worth hundreds of millions personally. You have an army of lawyers at your disposal if you want them, and so you personally have very little to fear from an aggressive police force. Besides, you donate money to political campaigns, remember? The politicians who direct those police are interested in your well-being. What about other economic issues, such as the massive wealth gap in the U.S., or peace protesters objecting to continuous war, or protesters concerned about the environment? Do you have an incentive to report favorably on those? Of course not, just the opposite. And we can add lots of other items to this list, such as single-payer healthcare. Having employees depend upon healthcare benefits you. It keeps them in line and makes them afraid to leave. So what do these economic incentives have in common? Economically, the mainstream news has an incentive to present an establishment, that is to say an economically conservative bias. Okay, so we've looked at the kinds of biases you're incentivized to have for economic issues. What about social issues like these? Do you have an incentive to report favorably or unfavorably regarding gay marriage? You might have a personal opinion, but you do not have an economic incentive to care much one way or another. If you have any economic incentive, it is to mirror the views of your audience, which would be biased towards the center. Do you have an incentive to care about abortion rights? You might have a personal opinion, but your company doesn't really stand to gain financially from this one way or another. How are you incentivized to report on people who want to take down Confederate statues? Again, UltraCorp is neither helped nor harmed by such statues. Chances are you're incentivized to go with the wind of public opinion and to avoid alienating people who buy your products or your advertisers. What about the entertainment industry? Do you care about depictions of sex and violence? How does your news report on these issues? Again, this isn't a major source of profit. If your movies and television series are popular, and if they contain such material, then you might have an incentive to support free expression here. Do you care if a Democrat or Republican is elected? Remember that you are lobbying politicians. Politicians from both parties are taking UltraCorp's money and serving UltraCorp's interests. Even if the average Democratic voter might want higher corporate taxes or more corporate regulations, the mainstream Democratic candidates do not. They tend to serve your interests. Mainstream Democrats are economically conservative and differ from mainstream Republicans primarily on social issues, at least the politicians. You will tend to have an establishment bias here. You want things to be stable and profitable. So, how are you incentivized to report on social issues? The answer is that you will tend to have a socially moderate bias because you do not have a direct economic incentive to hold strong positions on social issues. Okay, before we wrap up, let me ask you how you would portray your own news coverage. Even though you have an economically conservative bias and a socially moderate one, would you publicly wonder about whether you have too much of a liberal bias? Doing so sure serves your interests. If people think that a moderate or conservative perspective is liberal, then they will overcorrect to be more likely to favor legislation that is even more favorable to the wealthy and to corporations. How might you try to convince people that you have a liberal bias, or even come to believe it yourself? Well, you can point to your support of a Democratic candidate. Even though mainstream Democratic politicians are not economically liberal, They are seen as the Liberal Party because they are slightly left of the Republicans. You can also point to your coverage on social issues. UltraCorp doesn't exert editorial influence when you report on things such as gay rights or transgender use of restrooms because these do not affect UltraCorp's profits. But those issues are seen as liberal. If you do not distinguish between bias on economic issues and bias on social issues, you can point to this as evidence of being liberal. In short, the myth of a liberal media helps to support your economic agenda. So, this was just a very general thought experiment. The point of this was just to get you to begin thinking about how economic forces might shape news coverage. Thanks for your time.